Escuchas Ecos de AED.
This rapid trend towards cultural diversity in the U.S. in general is reflected in the changing demographics of the U.S. church. The North American church is browning, if you will, as white representation is in decline and all other ethnic groups are together increasing. Immigration from Latin America, Africa, Asia is fueling this rapid ecclesial change. And in fact, 1 in 3 American evangelicals is now a person of color.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos de AED. Un podcast de la Asociación para la Educación Teológica Hispana.
I want to now introduce my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Jessica Lugo Melendez, who is, I'm going to introduce her twice today, and that is only fitting. First, in her institutional leadership capacity, that's this one right now, and then later in her capacity as a thought leader in this space. And I think that double introduction is really important because it gets at something of her role in all of these efforts. She is an institutional leader of the First Order. She is also a visionary thought leader who thinks deeply about what's happening. So she'll get 2 introductions. For now, though, let me introduce you to Dr. Jessica Lugo, the Executive Director of AYET, Candler's Just and Durable Partnership in these efforts.
Good morning. Buenos días. On behalf of the Association for Hispanic Theological Education, better known as AED, our board of directors, our membership, and our community at large, we bring greetings. We are beyond excited about this event that started from a conversation last year with Catherine and Justo back in California. And it made its way all the way here into Candler and eventually to us. And because of that dream, because of that conversation, we are here today. Briefly, for those of you who do not know who AED is, we are a network of people and institutions that since 1991 have been working in the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, and most recently in Latin America. We dedicate ourselves to promote theological education of excellence, building bridges between the church and the academy. We exist to form men and women of the Hispanic community to become leaders that transform their communities, their societies, and the world. We are a community of experts and leaders who share the passion for theological education. And our network is a diverse one made of educators, scholars, pastors, leaders, community activators, denominational leaders, nonprofit leaders, among many others. We are grateful with the Just and Durable Partnership that we have flourished and nurtured for many, many years with Candler School of Theology. We are grateful with Dr. Jonathan Strom, Ted Smith, mi amigo, and Dr. Joanne Solis Walker, which we excuse today. She could not be here because she's a busy woman and she's doing very busy and important things. And I just want to shout out a word of gratitude to both DIF and the Candler team. May you please stand up, DIF staff and the Candler La Mesa team, please. Where are you? They are the true heroes behind everything that you have been experiencing between last night and today. So we say thank you to La Mesa Academy team, to Candler's team, and to AED team, and to our Centro, Justo and Catherine Gonzalez team, which is here represented by its director, Dr. Ondina Gonzalez. Thank you. Those of you who are traveling back home today, safe travels. And those of you who stayed, please keep sharing the good word of the gospel here and beyond. Thank you.
Friends, we are here to celebrate this book because it is a classic. And I use that language of classic in a kind of precise and academic sense. A classic is a book that changes the conversation when it comes out. And this book changed the conversation when it came out. It changed the conversation in Hispanic and Latine circles. It changed the conversation beyond those circles. It changed the conversation in global theology. But what makes a book a classic and not just an influential text is that generations later, it continues to unfold in its significance, and it speaks anew to new times. And that is what this book continues to do. It continues to speak revelatory words. As I was revisiting it in preparation for this gathering, I saw again its power to illumine. If you want to understand the ferocity, the wanton, impractical cruelty of the ice raids, then to really understand it, you need to understand what this book says about the way the Latine population confronts white Anglophone America with our non-innocence. Our non-innocence. So when it's that drive towards a restoration of innocence that leads to this pathological cruelty. It continues to reveal the times to us. I also saw its fresh relevance in its call to action. There's a funny passage here where 35 years ago, he's saying, the mainline denominations continue to decline, and they look around you could have written that passage right now, right? Only with more urgency. But then the book closes with this vision for a combination of spirituality and justice that makes the dichotomy between those two passages those two movements seem just ridiculous. Right? And it calls us to a deep renewal that holds those things together. That is what we need now. And most of all, from this book, I took what I needed right now in these difficult days, and that is hope. And here I can only quote from it directly. Justo writes, "Mañana is much more than tomorrow. It is the radical questioning of today. For those who control the present order of society, today is the time to build for tomorrow, and tomorrow will bring about the fruits of what they sow today. For impoverished Hispanics and others, the real mañana is a time unlike today. It is a time of a new reality, not the outcome of today's disorderly order, but the outcome of other factors that bring about a breach with an unbearable today." The disorderly order. Is there a better phrase for what we see in the streets? Disorderly order. And is there a better prayer than a breach with an unbearable today? Thank you for this classic. And I trust that in 35 years, it will be speaking anew to another generation, because that's what classics do. That is why we are here, and one of the joys of convening a conference in honor of such luminous figures and such an important classic is that it's really easy because no one turns you down. Everyone that we asked to do anything for this conference said yes. And as soon as we started to plan, we knew that we needed the Reverend Dr. Robert Chao Romero to give a lecture, and we are thrilled that he is here to do that today. He is a historian, an attorney, a pastor, a community organizer. He is a full professor in the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano Studies and Central American Studies at UCLA. He's the author of multiple books, including The Chinese in Mexico, which won an award from the Latin American Studies Association, and Brown Church, which was recognized by InterVarsity Press with a Reader's Choice Award. Think about that. So, award from a major academic guild, and then an award for a Reader's Choice book that really reached a wide population. What kind of scholar might have that sort of respect within the academy and popular reach? Who could be a more fitting speaker on Justo González than Robert Chao Romero? And I'm thrilled that we have responses from Dr. Antonio Eduardo Alonso, who is Associate Professor of Theology and Culture right here at Candler, with particular interest in worship practices as they migrate across all kinds of contexts. His first book, Commodified Communion, was recognized with the Hispanic Theological Initiative's Book Prize, and rightly so. I could go on with a long scholarly resume, but in addition to that scholarly resume, he really is one of the most significant composers of worship music in the world today. He composed the Mass for Pope Francis's American visit, and he's been nominated for a Latin Grammy, and he's going to be opening for Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl.
What?
Okay, that part's not true, but if Jay-Z knew what he was doing, he would have Tony there on the keys. That's all I'm saying. And I want to offer now the second half, or the complementary part of an introduction of the Reverend Dr. Jessica Lugo Melendez, who's the executive director of Ayet. She is ordained in the American Baptist tradition, and she has served in ministry in multiple contexts. She also has served as a professor of the history of Christianity, New Testament, and evangelism at the graduate level. She is faculty with La Mesa, we are proud to say. She also holds an MBA with an emphasis in strategic planning, and I can testify firsthand that she is a faithful friend and a person of great integrity. And when she says she prays for you, she prays for you. And that is one of the warmest introductions I can offer, and with such gratitude. What I want to say is that in her present role, she brings all of those skills together. And that's exactly what this moment needs. And so we're so grateful for her leadership. I'm going to ask you all just to proceed one after another with no further words from me.
Okay.
So please join me in welcoming Dr. Romero.
In difficult times, a little bit higher, is that okay? You can hear me okay? Celebration is the strongest form of resistance. So today we celebrate in these tough times, and I am so honored, so happy to be here. Thank you, Ayeth and Candler and Dr. Ondina and Dr. Jessica, so many people for the invitation to be here. When I got the invitation, remember I was sitting at my kitchen table and I almost fell off the chair because I felt so honored. And so it's wonderful to be here. I first came across Mañana 25 years ago when I was a young grad student. I was visiting Chicago and I was walking around for a conference, and I went into a bookstore near the University of Chicago, and I picked this up. Just several years before God had gotten a hold of my life, I grew up in Latino Baptist churches, American Baptist churches, and I knew God growing up, but it was when I was in law school in my mid-20s that Jesus really got a hold of my life, and I felt a calling to become a professor. And as a professor, to address issues of race and Christianity. And it was several years later that I found Mañana. And little did I know that this would be a signpost for the direction my life would take. So I'm grateful. Thank you, Dr. Justo. Mañana changed the way that I view Christian theology and just Christianity in general. So growing up at Iglesia Bautista El Salvador, we were an immigrant church, families from Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and there were many good things about that. We came to know Jesus personally as the Lord who would change our lives. We came to read scripture for the first time, but unfortunately, we also inherited a very individualistic expression of the gospel. And we were not really taught about a social ethic. What did Jesus have to say about the poor? And the gospel that we received was very intertwined, sometimes unintentionally, with Anglo-American culture. And Mañana helped me both to appreciate my roots and understand that the gospel preached and embodied by Christ encompasses all of God's creation. It also helped me to understand that my own ethnic culture, as a descendant of Mexican and Chinese immigrants, is a natural fruit of the stewardship of creation. And therefore, that my own cultural lenses are valuable for the task of theological reflection. Very soon after beginning my job as a professor of Chicano studies at UCLA in 2005, I began to meet students like Carlos. And I'm going to share a note that Carlos wrote to me in a class that I taught about the Brown Church. Carlos says, as a Latino growing up as the son of an undocumented pastor in the Midwest, my experience was much different from those who surrounded me. I felt that I could not identify with my peers, and I always felt out of place. And Carlos's story here, it's reflective of what Michelle shared last night. Being in that big kind of megachurch that again, there are good things about it and this personal relationship with Christ, but something was still off. It's hard to find the words to put your finger on it, but something was off. Likewise, Carlos said, my white peers accepted me in the way that I stood in right by being part of their denomination. But I was not accepted because of my skin color, my race, or my father's undocumented status. I wanted to believe in what my family and church taught me as truth, but I slowly drifted away from my beliefs as a result of the testimony I received from the Anglo Church and their members. Even to this day, they referred to us as wetbacks, beaners, and spicks. I find myself conflicted with my identity. And maybe there's somebody or multiple people in this room who with that same struggle, right? I'm so grateful because Mañana provides a path forward, right? Dr. Justo, Dr. Catherine, and many in the Brown Church for decades have been wrestling with these same questions of spiritual deconstruction and reconstruction. And so there's hope. And that's why we celebrate today. Many of my students, again, find themselves in the spiritual borderlands. On the one hand, they grow up in Latino immigrant churches, again, come to know Jesus. There are deep, personal, real, wonderful things that happen. But then they go to the university and they learn about systemic injustices and history, and also about the way in which institutional Christianity has been intertwined with those injustices. And they go back to their home churches and they say, Pastor, Mom, Dad, like I'm learning this stuff, about the history of colonization, about nationalism. What does the gospel have to say about this? And they're told, mijo, mija, don't worry about that. Like that's just Democrat liberal stuff, or that's not the gospel. Just focus on the gospel. At the same time, they go to oftentimes back to activist circles, which is where I spend most of my time, right? Chicano studies. And they're told, you cannot be a Christian and care about justice. Christianity is only a colonizer's religion. And so now there are millions of young people who are stuck, right? This was bad 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Right now, it's fever pitch, right? And it's estimated 1 million young people that are leaving the church in the U.S. every year. 1 million. 1 million. Do the math. Right? By the end of our talk, how many more young people will leave the church? Right? And again, this is not new, right? And writing, again, in Mañana, Dr. Justo said, younger generations of Hispanic Americans, spurred by the example of Afro-Americans and other minorities, are turning to their cultural roots. And we find that exactly happening today. And again, my students don't realize that brown theologians like Don Justo have been walking the same road of spiritual reconstruction for the past 60 years. And Mañana provides a time-tested roadmap for the often perilous task of theological deconstruction and reconstruction. Mañana, to borrow John Henry Newman's framework of faithful development, Mañana also reflects the vital characteristic of chronic vigor. It has endured and continued to bear overflowing spiritual fruit for more than 3 decades. So my remarks today are expressed in gratitude. Thank you for the way in which Mañana has shown a theological light for myself and many others who have wandered in the spiritual borderlands. My remarks will focus upon 5 key theological signposts from Mañana, which shed light upon the current state of ecclesial affairs and offer guidance for the way forward. The signposts are a new Reformation. I'm happy to share copies of my paper also with whoever would like it. A new Reformation, Fuente Ovejuna, or communal theological insights from the Brown Church. 3rd, creation, culto, cultura y cultivo. 4, reading the Bible in Spanish, which we've talked about. And 5, Mañana, living now into the new creation. To kind of blast to the past, in 1990, when this book came out, I had just graduated from high school, from Los Altos High School. And Mañana made the bold claim then that a new reformation of the 20th century had begun. Dr. Justo posited 3 macro events and 5 characteristics which marked this new reformation. These macro events consisted of, number 1, the end of the Constantinian era and the concomitant rise of what was then the New Right. 2, the failure of the North. And 3, a growing self-consciousness of the peoples of the global South and minorities and women in the United States. So, speaking of the end of the Constantinian era, Dr. Justo writes, "It is the end of this era. Ever since the 4th century, the church has existed in politically and socially advantageous conditions. Christianity has been allied with the existing order of society and has profited from it. The new right defends the old wrongs in the name of Christian civilization. The protagonists may win an election or 2. They may even hope to turn the United States into a fascist state. But in terms of long-range history, they are already defeated." Again, as was mentioned last night, I think by Michelle, these insights ring eerily true. Right? Secondly, failure of the North. Girded with modernist hubris, nations of the North Atlantic during the 19th century promised, quote, to usher in a new era of prosperity for humankind. In the words of Mark Lau Branson and Alan Roxburgh, at the heart of this hubris lies modernity's wager. And simply, this is a wager that life can be lived well without God. Human beings seen as autonomous, self-making individuals whose identities are not given but plastic and therefore malleable to all kinds of social administration. Autonomy, plasticity, and self-making are the marks of modernity's wager, and the creation of technocratic elites with the skills to manage and control desired outcomes. Well, as Justo observed in 1990, modernity has lost the bet. From a theological perspective, I would also state that another characteristic of the failure of the North is that the modernist fundamentalist debates of a century ago have finally run their course. On the one hand, Christian fundamentalism has morphed into MAGA. As the North American church has diversified through immigration from Latin America, Asia, and Africa in recent years, a reactionary movement of white Christian nationalism has arisen which conflates the church with U.S. civil religion and rejects immigrant Christians as undesirable newcomers and even illegitimate believers. And as has been mentioned, one result is that millions of young people, Latino and of all cultural backgrounds, are leaving the church. Despite their loud and vocal presence in the popular U.S. imagination, this brand of Christianity, white evangelical Christianity, is in sharp numerical decline. At the opposite religious and political pole, a movement of progressive Christianity has surfaced in recent years to challenge the rise of white Christian nationalism. And for this, I'm grateful. Largely expressed through the mainline denominational descendants of the fundamentalist-modernist debates, some elements of this politically progressive expression of Christianity, and I stress the social implications of the gospel while de-emphasizing personal experiences of radical spiritual encounter with the Holy Spirit. Now, as was mentioned earlier, similar to their more conservative evangelical counterparts, unfortunately, many white mainline Protestants have also experienced a steady decline in numbers, coupled with the median older age of 50. Mañana speaks of this downturn as it was manifesting itself in the 80s and the 90s. And this quote was referenced, but the full quote says, mainline churches, painfully aware of uninspiring statistics, eagerly grope for explanations and solutions. Most of what one hears are easy prescriptions, as if the malaise had to do essentially with structural matters that some program or constitutional revision could fix. The fundamentalist modernist debates of a century ago seem to have reached the end of a road, as their contemporary denominational progeny do not seem to possess within themselves what is required to successfully address the pressing problems and spiritual hunger of our day. There is a feeling that there must be something more than Christianity as a Sunday morning reiteration of a conservative or progressive political talk show. Though these two poles of Euro-American Christianity by no means represent the full denominational spectrum of Christianity in North America, the political and cultural divisions which they represent are to be found within most other Christian denominations, including the Roman Catholic Church. Neither Christianity as a frame for progressive activism, bereft of deep spiritual encounter, nor Christianity as a proxy for religious nationalism and personal self-fulfillment is sufficient to meet the deepest spiritual hungers of the coming generations. And again, owing to these factors, you have a growing number of people who are identifying as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right? Religiously disaffiliated. It's estimated that religiously unaffiliated will increase to 26% of the U.S. population by 2050. That translates into 111 million individuals. As in the days of Jesus of Nazareth, however, hope sometimes springs from unexpected and forsaken places, such as Galilee of the Gentiles, or in the words of Orlando Costas, from Christ outside the gate. Mañana and the rapidly growing immigrant church holds much promise for the future revitalization of Christianity in North America. At the same time that North America is experiencing such an overall marked collapse in formal religious identification, North America is also experiencing a diversity explosion, reminiscent of John's vision of the New Jerusalem of people from every language, tongue, tribe, and nation. The United States is in the early stages of a profound racial and ethnic mestizaje, in which cultural groups from every continent on the globe are freely mixing in a historically unprecedented way. From 2010 to 2020, the multiracial population of the U.S. grew 276% to 33.8 million people. The Black population increased from 38.9 million to 46.9 million. The American Indian and Alaska Native population alone, and in combination, increased from 5.2 million to 9.7. The Hispanic Latino population climbed by 23% to 62.1 million. And the Asian American community, comprised of people with origins in East Asia, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, increased to 24 million. You get the picture. The Census Bureau projects that the multiracial population will triple by 2060, and it's estimated that as much as 20% of the entire U.S. population will be mixed race by 2050. Maybe Vasconcelos was right, but he happened to be just a couple hundred miles off in his geography. This rapid trend towards cultural diversity in the U.S. in general is reflected in the changing demographics of the U.S. church. The North American church is browning, if you will, as white representation is in decline and all other ethnic groups are together increasing. Immigration from Latin America, Africa, Asia is fueling this rapid ecclesial change. And in fact, 1 in 3 American evangelicals is now a person of color. Accordingly, approximately 1/4 of all Christians in the U.S. come from first-generation immigrant families. As part of these rapid changes, grassroots expressions of church are gradually replacing the formal structures and practices of Euro-American Christendom. These domestic trends coincide with the fact that the global pendulum of Christianity has already swung in the direction of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. As Alan Ye writes, Christianity has always been polycentric, and it now has a new geographic center. The expression that Christianity is a, quote, white man's religion is already not true. The present and future face of the Church of Jesus of Nazareth is brown, and Christianity is returning to its historical origins as a faith of the marginalized born in the Near East. This supplies a hermeneutical advantage, for as discussed in Mañana, Scripture was birthed and first interpreted by those at the margins of society. According to Dr. Justo, North Atlantic male theology is no longer taken to be normative. Universal theology, to which then women, other minorities, and people from the younger churches may add their footnotes. Hispanic theology, whose first steps we witness, is but one element of that vast Reformation and can be properly understood only when viewed within that larger context. Christian immigrants from the majority world bring with them a vibrant personal faith driven by radical dependence on Jesus, made necessary by suffering and the struggle to survive. There's an abuelita faith, or grandmother's faith, that has been tested and purified by many testimonies of God's faithfulness and passed down to successive generations. Global theologians also bring distinct perspectives that have the potential to address many of the burning spiritual and social questions facing the North American church. Calvin and Zwingli have good things to say, but little poignance for pressing issues of race and culture. The faith of immigrants will revitalize the U.S. church in many ways unforeseen, and from such faith, revival can certainly spring. Stated another way, Christians from the global South bring distinct God-given community cultural wealth and spiritual capital to the waning U.S. church. As was mentioned last night several times, as Latinas and Latinos, we read the Bible through the lens of our God-given community cultural wealth. We read the Bible in Spanish or with Hispanic eyes. But this new Reformation requires that we read the Bible not only in Spanish, but in Arabic, Chinese, Laotian, Tagalog, Hindi, Swahili, and through the lenses of all the cultural groups which God has created. As a Jesuit has somewhere said, we will not know God fully until the gospel reaches all of the countries of the world. Mañana predicted all of these trends 35 years ago. To be honest, I think that Mañana was a little bit ahead of its time. The new Reformation is now a bit clearer for many others to see. Dr. Justo is like Peter Abelard, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus. I don't want you to get burned at the stake, though. Or Erasmus, right? Who sounded the clarion call before most could hear it or had eyes to see the coming storm of the Protestant Reformation. I'm reminded of Luther's famous statement about Jan Hus. We are all Hussites without knowing it. All of us in this room are Gonzalites without knowing it. Share another story that I think captures some of the current trends and the ways in which Mañana speaks to this day. And this is a kind of a compilation story based upon stories that I've heard. Ruben and Sandra were gemelos. They're twins. They immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico, fleeing gang violence and poverty. In Mexico, their parents, Juan and Emilia, had come to faith in Christ through a white U.S. missionary named Jim. Jim often told them about how the U.S. was a land of freedom, liberty, and economic opportunity, and how God had blessed the country because its founders were Christian. And this story that I'm sharing, it's very common. I think many of us can relate to this story. Juan thought to himself, my gosh, if this one person is so educated and brings so much economic wealth to our little town, can you imagine what the U.S. must be like? It must be like paradise. Missionary Jim saw that Juan was a gifted preacher and had many spiritual gifts. Once Juan preached to a crowd of 100 people, and everyone streamed to the altar, giving their lives to Christ. And Juan became invited to the U.S. To work for the same Christian organization. But Juan soon became disenchanted as he crashed. After coming to the U.S., disenchanted as he crashed into the wall of denominational racial paternalism and outright racism. For their children, Ruben and Sandra, even though they were top students and athletes, and their father was even a pastor, they often experienced racism when attending the Americano youth group. Ruben and Sandra went to college looking for answers. How could their social identity as followers of Christ be reconciled with their ethnic cultural identity as Latinos? In their ethnic studies classes, they found good answers which explained the inequalities they grew up with, both in Mexico and Santa Ana. They found few spiritual answers, however, as many professors expressed outright animus towards their inherited Christian faith, with little room for nuance. One semester during sophomore year, Sandra decided to take a class on the historical Jesus. She found some things interesting and others confusing. She learned about Jesus' marginalized status as a poor Galilean, son of a carpenter and family which was colonized by the Romans. One of the books they read, however, claimed that Jesus was a violent revolutionary, and another that he was misogynistic and ethnocentric. Her professor also claimed that Jesus' divinity was a later invention, that Jesus was likely married to Mary Magdalene. Sandra found herself confused. And I think that happens also probably to many young Latinos. You're looking for answers, confused, have this personal faith and grow up in the church, and then it's very easy to become disoriented. Curious about churches that she was not familiar with, Sandra decided to start visiting one of them, a church that was outside of her tradition of origin. The parishioners were welcoming and kind, though most were older and white. And that was fine. Her parents had taught her to respect people of all cultural backgrounds. Sandra was so surprised, in a good way, that the first sermon she heard talked openly about issues of social justice. This was so refreshing. And she was grateful because she had never heard such issues discussed in church. But after a few months, she was kind of tired. There was almost an exclusive focus on justice issues, and she missed the deep personal encounters with the Holy Spirit from her parents' church. Her abuelita had even been miraculously healed of heart problems after a prayer service, and so she had no doubt that Jesus was real and that he transformed lives. A later sermon, or homily, as they called it, was even titled The Gospel According to Rachel Maddow. It's hard to put my finger on it, she whispered to herself, but this church and the class I took feel just as white as the conservative churches I left, but just from a different direction. Sandra was confused. Phyllis Tickle wrote that every 500 years, the church has a rummage sale, a venta de garaje, if you will. Every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutionalized Christianity, whatever they may be at the time, it doesn't matter, Catholic, Protestant, blah, blah, blah. Every 500 years, the institutions become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered in order that renewal and new growth may occur. About every 500 years, the church feels compelled to hold a giant rummage sale, writes Anglican Bishop Mark Dwyer. We are living in and through one of these 500-year sales. And in Mañana, Justo supplies the theological roadmap for the rummage sale. So if you're feeling this, gosh, like this rummage sale thing is really resonating, again, you're not alone. You're not alone. You have good roadmap here, good GPS. And IF, the Gonzalez Center, La Mesa offer behind the wheels training using this roadmap for pastors, students, and families, like the stories I've shared. As mentioned earlier, Dr. Justo supplies theological signposts. Excuse me. I'm not contagious. Don't worry. I'm like 13 days into this thing that's going around, so biologically impossible for me to pass anything on. But theological signposts, fuente o vejuna, communal theological reflection, creation, culto, cultura y cultivo, reading the Bible in Spanish, mañana, living now into the new creation. I'm not going to go into. Oh, thank you. That would be helpful. Thanks. I encourage you all to get your copy of Mañana and dig deep into these themes. I do want to talk about more about fuente o vejuna, or communal theology. I'll do that and then close with an example. I think for me, fuente o vejuna, again, it provides an approach or a method. We've often heard the expression, if you give someone a fish, they can eat for a day. But if you teach them to fish, well, you know the rest of the saying, right? The approach of fuente o vejuna has taught me to fish. A method of communal theology, quote, a constant dialogue among the entire community. It consists of communal theological reflection upon the sacred, as opposed to, quote, the exaggerated individualism of much of the theological guild, where, quote, theologians like medieval knights joust with one another, while their peers look at the contest from a distance, if they look at all, right? And we're all bloodied afterwards, and like people don't even care. In the acknowledgement section, Dr. Justo speaks of the community of interlocutors which shape Mañana. He says, most of them I do not even know by name. Many are ancient Christian writers who have now been my companions in life for over 3 decades. Others are colleagues and friends, both in this country and throughout the world, whose writings and conversations have taught me much. I'm not sure how much you intended your readers to dwell on those 2 lines, but I've thought about those lines, those 2 sentences for like the last 4 years. And books like Worship in the Early Church and A Concise History of Christian Doctrine have led me down a delightful theological path of our ancestors. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius, Cyril, Augustine, St. Anthony. Every morning, not every, but I pray like the Coptic Agbeya prayer book, which is like the oldest prayer book from Egypt, Desert Fathers and Mothers. And as I've reflected upon Dr. Justo's words, I've come to understand that communal theological reflection means the whole church. The communion of saints over 2,000 years. Fuente o vejuna represents the intercultural, intergenerational, cross-socioeconomic community of believers over 2,000 years. The local church, the global church, our ancestors in the faith from every tribe, language, nation, and tongue who have gone before us, women and men of every age. We need the combined insight of all members of the body of Christ to fully understand the gospel and to know God more fully. No one's left out. No one is an add-on. Indeed, God has even given greater honor to the parts that lack it. Christianity, to borrow an expression from Andrew Walls, Christianity is a generational process. It therefore includes all the generations. Many conversations around theological deconstruction today, however, act as if Christianity has only existed for 500 years. On the right, that means from the time of the Protestant Reformation. On the left, that often means since about the time of Columbus. Circumscribed by the era of European colonialism, we end up fighting over a limited set of theological constructs, categories, and presuppositions. Round and round we go. Meanwhile, the geographic centers of Christianity have already moved on. I think of what C.S. Lewis said, if you join at 11 o'clock, a conversation which began at 8, you will often not see the real bearing of what is said. And so in order to understand where we are now as the church in the U.S., we need to understand history. And that's why I feel such a kindred spirit, right? With Justo and Catherine as historians. As I've learned from the story of Christianity, the movement of Jesus of Nazareth existed for 1,500 years before the arrival of European colonialism. For the first 1,000 years of church history, the geographic center of Christianity was Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The Emperor of China first contemplated the truths of Christianity at the same time as the English King of Northumbria. My Egyptian Coptic Orthodox friends are the stewards of a Christian tradition tracing back to Mark, with the exception of about 100 years, they've been persecuted ever since. You might call the church of the first 1,000 years the original Brown Church. By this, I mean the diverse global church which existed prior to the social construction of whiteness as a theological and sociological construct, as a justification for colonialism. There's so much more that I can say. As I've previously stated, I found most conversation around theological and spiritual deconstruction focus upon 1492 to the present. So if the resurrection of Jesus was 8 a.m., then 1492 to the present is like 4 to 5 p.m. And we're stuck there. It's like Groundhog Day. And so I guess I'm going to just like say it really simply. The framework that I've kind of maybe absorbed from Dr. Justo Mañana is got to go back to the sources, right? Scriptures, of course. But what were the theological understandings of those that canonized the scriptures, right? The scriptures didn't just fall down from the sky, right? It's like people have been, it doesn't mean the early church got it all right, but you have to have a foundation to start. And then, we can discern, what is faithful theological development from those foundations. But right now, it's like a free-for-all. It doesn't matter left, right, center. It's like, I'm reading the Bible. This is what I think it means. Therefore, this is what it means. And we just, it's untenable. It's untenable. And I'm going over time. Just one last example. I think I can, in my 2026 Chicano sort of cultural framework, I understand the gospel now as, and from Mañana, gospel of the pelados. I'm not sure how many Mexicanos we have in the room, too. Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure how much this example is going to translate, right? Pelados is like, it's like, people that are broke, poor, from the lowest social class, excluded. Someone's uncultured, it has these negative connotations. A meaner term is called naco, right? And the flip side of naco and pelado is fresa, or white skin, snobby, arrogant, upper class, spoiled, blah blah blah, right? It doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean like, oh, my cousin Susano has red hair is like bad or something, or my grandfather was bad because he had blonde hair, but it's more like just the snobbiness, right? There's all these hilarious synonyms too, like that's a fresa de Costco. Boy, she's fresa, but she drives a Jetta. Fresa mindset, target paycheck. You get the picture, right? and from where my commute, most people in my world think that Jesus was a fresa. The early church were fresas, were whiteskins, right? But as Dr. Justo González says, they've never heard of the divine scandal of Jesus el Pelado, the stumbling block of Constantinian theology. Jesus, the carpenter from Galilee, who was called the Christ, the very real and human figure of the carpenter crucified by the ruling powers, crying in his distress, and yet declared to be very God. The Son of God, creator of heaven and earth, who called creation very good, who planted within creation the very seeds of diverse ethnic cultures, and who returned because we turned away and ruined the plan, Culto, cultivo, cultura, worship, stewardship of creation, and the creation of culture, all interconnected. The Son of God came incarnate to the very world that he created, to unite humanity and all of creation to himself, to heal creation from the inside. The triune God, the very model of sharing and unity across distinctiveness, men, women equal in Christ, justice, mercy, all peoples flourishing, the union of all things under Christ, new creation. In the words of one early Brown Church ancestor, God became human so that humans could become divine. Jesus became what we are, that he might make us what he is. The gospel of the pelado. And this is the hope of mañana. The world will not always be as it is. God is already doing a new thing, and we can join it by the power of the Spirit. Mañana is here. Mañana is here. So let's celebrate.
Thank you so much, Robert, both for that as well as your incredible work on the Brown Church, to which we all owe you such a great debt. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to take my too brief time to think with you about two mañanas, the future of Latine theology in the wake of Justo's book, and the eternal mañana to which all of our work points. As all of the panelists last night, if you were there, articulated so poignantly, in Mañana, Justo, you gave us a voice. You created a vocabulary and you developed a discourse that centered the lived lives of Latines in the U.S. and all their complexity and difference, an approach born of the embodied knowledge of a pastor and a scholar, grounded in community. An insistence that all theologians broaden our reflection to include more of whose practices and whose lives matter for theological reflection, while also making so many of us Latine theologians cry tears of recognition at what has always been most true for us, even if that truth has rarely made the pages of a book of academic theology. But I know you pulled me aside a few weeks ago and you said you don't want this to be about ayer, you really want this to be about mañana. And so as I cast my own gaze toward the mañana of Latine theology, I have found myself dwelling in a tension that is increasingly intensified for me in recent years in my teaching, in my scholarship, and in my pastoral ministry. I worry that the assertion of too strong a Latine cultural identity that has marked much of Latine theology in the last couple of decades sometimes obscures even what it wants to reveal. While identifying a shared Latine identity has been and remains vital in light of its theological, political, social, and economic implications, especially in these times, sometimes I worry that too strong a construction of that identity can have consequences that outrun even our best intentions and most faithful quests for justice. In our affirmation of the importance of one kind of difference, we can risk unwittingly neglecting many others, even within our communities. Let me name just one, a hard one. I confess I read Fuente Ovejuna and Justo's reading of it through a different lens today than when Cecilia Gonzalez Andreu handed me my first copy at Loyola Marymount University in 2010. Indeed, I can't help but read that beautiful and hopeful image of collective solidarity expressed in the community's unified answer to the question, ¿Quién mató el comendador?, with a tinge of melancholy. Because anything resembling a unison, Fuente Ovejuna, señor, from U.S. Latines seems so distant to me in our present milieu. Not only would I expect a greater multiplicity of answers, if I'm honest, I would need to brace myself for the fact that many Latines, would want to keep the comendador in place. at the expense even of each other. And if we're truthful, familia, it is not only the response of the fresas in their many guises that might give us pause. We must contend empirically, pastorally, theologically with the fact that the head of the Proud Boys during the January 6th insurrection was Afro-Cuban, a Catholic from Little Havana. That the pastor of Quilmar Abrego Garcia's immigrant church was until very recently an enthusiastic supporter of the president and his policies. That the 2 Border Patrol agents who shot and killed Alex Preddy as he put his own life on the line in solidarity with Latines in Minneapolis are themselves Latine. And not only did the Latine vote increase substantially in support of the present administration in the last election, it was in no small part due to the pelados who contributed to that success. Indeed, as with white voters, non-college Hispanic voters were more likely to back Trump than Hispanic voters with college degrees. To oversimplify, more fresas voted for Harris, more pelados voted for Trump, and many more stayed home. And so I find myself asking, how do we as theologians and pastors who so often pour out our lives and our scholarship striving to center precisely the least among us, respond to the fact that those we claim to center are presently answering the question, ¿Quién mató el comendador? By pointing at their own vecinos, by pointing at us? And how do we, in the face of such a reality, resist the temptation to merely point the finger back at them? All of this and more pushes us into the very complexity, ambiguity, and nuance to which Robert invited us. The fact that not only are millions fleeing the church, but that many more who stay leave unchanged, or worse, leave with hearts hardened even to those most proximate to them, even somehow alienated from our own present reality. But this truth also confronts those of us who have at times been too enthusiastic to confidently identify the reign of God with the often anemic alternatives that have been served up in their many forms. Instead, to look and look again, to listen and listen again to those who have been rendered invisible by the entire system in which we find ourselves, whatever our politics. It invites us to bind the wounds of those who are so often victims of systems designed not only to oppress, but even worse, designed to algorithmically convince people to campaign for their own oppression. Here, I can't help but repeat one of the most direct and powerful enunciations in Mañana. The death of many gods has meant life for countless human beings. Indeed, there are many gods that still need to die, even in us. So what, then, is the shape of hope in these impossible times? In the final chapter of the book, Justo gives us a glimpse of an eschatological vision of a mañana that is a word of judgment on today. He foregrounds the eschatological expectations so real in many Latine churches, yet so often suspected by sophisticated white liberal theologians. Perhaps ruffling even the theological feathers of some of us here, even implicitly challenging some of the hymns I myself have written, he denounces a phrase that too easily rolls off the tongue of preachers and hymn writers and well-meaning prophets of this day. God has no hands but your hands. This is not only a misinterpretation, he writes, but a blasphemy. The Lord may wish to use us as hands, he writes, but were we to fail, there is no doubt that the Lord would find other hands to carry forth the divine purpose. Put differently, Justo is decidedly not proclaiming the gospel of Rachel Maddow, of which Sandra grew so weary. Instead, he exhorts to have the Spirit is to have a foot up on the stirrup of the eschatological future and to live now as those who expect a new reality, the coming reign of God. This vision, of course, does not absolve us of the work yet to be done under claims of human finitude in the light of a distant reign. It is instead a hope that discloses broken fragments of the new heaven and new earth breaking in, even as it insists that our practices, our beliefs, our lives can neither bring about the end of the present order, nor can they usher in the new one yet to come. It reminds us that yes, God works through our hands and feet in the world, including through all of our acts of daily resistance, large and small, to the present terror that is closing in all around us, but confesses a deeper hope still that God's activity is never confined by or identical to that work. It imbues all of our acts of solidarity and protest with an eschatological humility that sees that even our most careful resistances are incomplete and that hope does not finally depend on them. And precisely because, gracias a Dios, it does not all depend on us. It is a hope that frees us to resist more deeply, and with a clearer vision of the coming reign, one that seeks not merely the evolution of today and tomorrow, but rather the breach that mañana announces. And as one in frequent despair these days at the fragility of my own feeble responses in the face of the enormity of it all, I can only say, thanks be to God. Thank you.
Page 95 of Mañana says, the biblical view of omnipresence does not mean that there are no moments or places in which God is particularly present. It means rather that there is no place in which we cannot count on the presence of God. Even if this presence, as the psalmist is well aware of, is one of judgment, the biblical omnipresence of God is different from the metaphysical notion that goes by the same name and whose consequence is denial of the dynamic particularities of divine action. Grounded on divine action to lead. Good morning, and thank you for this meaningful event. It is truly an honor to respond to Dr. Chao Romero's conference. This conversation matters. You, us, being here today, now, aquí, ahora, matters. Because theological work should never be just theory. Theological work must shape our lives, shape our churches, our communities, and our future. I want to begin by locating myself, not as an explanation, but as grounding. I come to this response as a woman, a Latina, a Puerto Rican, a pastor, an educator, and a leader. As Ted mentioned earlier, I live and work in more than one world at the same time. Not because I'm divided, but because I'm formed that way. For a long time, I was told, directly and indirectly, that this was a problem. Too Latina for some spaces, not Latina enough for others, too church-centered for the academy, too critical for the church, too spiritual for activism, too strategic for pastoral work. But here's what I now know after my second reading of Mañana. My dual reality is not something to fix. It's something to steward. Again, that realization didn't happen overnight. I first encountered Mañana during my seminary years back in 2009, when I was searching for language big enough to hold faith and questions at the same time. I returned to it 15 years later as a leader carrying responsibility not just curiosity. Same book, very different postures. And that different matters. From my perspective, Mañana was never meant only to affirm those on the margins. As Dr. Romero reminds us, Mañana invites us to challenge the idea that one kind of theology, North Atlantic, dominant, is the norm, and that everything else is just a footnote. That challenge wasn't just about ideas. It's about who gets to lead. Romero calls Mañana a roadmap, not a destination. And I would add this. Roadmaps are for people who are going somewhere on purpose. So we need to know, where are we going? Which means the question today is not whether we belong in theological conversations. We belong in theological conversations. The question should be whether our institutions are ready for where we are needed to head. As a Puerto Rican woman, my experience doesn't fit neatly in common Latino categories. We are citizens, but we're not sovereign. We're not immigrants. We're shaped by displacement. We're deeply rooted in culture, yet living under an ongoing colonial reality. That complexity is not confusion. It is clarity earned the hard way. Such spaces allows me to see how power works, how faith adapts, and how people survive and even flourish without guarantees. This is not victimhood. This is formation. When Romero speaks of mestizaje as a promise, it resonates deeply. But promises require honesty. Without naming power, mestizaje can become romantic instead of liberating. What Mañana invites us to do now is not to abandon that vision, but to deepen it, own it, and act upon it. This is why I now read Mañana not only as a prophetic voice, but also as a leadership wisdom. The challenges facing the church today, loss of trust, polarization, burnout, young people walking away, are not just organizational problems. They are signs that old frameworks can no longer carry the weight of our realities. And let me say this clearly. Mañana is not the end of the story, nor just a book written 35 years ago. Mañana calls us to think differently. In my work with pastors and leaders across the Hispanic church, I meet people who are not asking how to survive. They are asking how to be faithful without pretending. They want a faith that holds justice and spirituality together, tradition and change, critique and hope. That hunger is holy and demands divine action. As a woman, I also want to name what still feels unfinished. Latina theology has opened doors, but opening doors is not the same as sharing authority. Fuente Ovejuna calls us not just to speak together, but to decide together, to experience God's divine action en conjunto. At AEF, this is not theoretical. We are not interested in recreating old hierarchies with new language. We are committed to forming leaders who can think deeply, lead courageously, and build institutions that last. Romero's image of Jesús el Pelado, and I've been pelada many times in my life, stays with me. A Jesus that not aligned with power, but with vulnerability, not abstract, not elite, not fresa, but deeply human. This Jesus refuses both nationalist Christianity and shallow progressism. It stands with the disposable and calls us as leaders to do the same. For many today, the question isn't whether there is something more. It is whether the church is brave enough to live it. For me, Mañana is no longer just about the future. It's about responsibility here, now, aquí, ahora. As a pastor, I hear the call to lead with tenderness and truth. As an educator, to form leaders with courage and depth. As a strategist, to build structures worthy of the people we serve. So I receive this conference with gratitude, Dr. Chao Romero, and also with confidence. Not because the work is done, but because we are no longer waiting for permission to continue in it. If Mañana taught us anything, Don Justo, is this: the future of theology belongs not to those who guard it, but to those who live it. Here, now, aquí, ahora. Because if we want a better Mañana, we must lead faithfully today. Thank you.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos teológicos.
Ecos de AED. Un podcast de la Asociación para la Educación Teológica Hispana.